Now that we have covered the basics of databases and migrations, let's actually run some SQL queries. We have this transactions page with total income, total expense, savings, and the goal displayed in here. Instead of hard-coding these values, we can populate them with real data since we already created the migration for our transactions table. As you might recall, we previously had a separate transactions route file, a transaction controller, and a transaction service class. I moved a few things around to make things simpler so that we could reuse and build upon them. Now, the transaction-related routes reside within our main web routes file, and the transaction controller has some methods that we need to fill in. I've also created a create transaction button in here, which sends us to a simple form page to add a new transaction. We will cover forms in more detail a little bit later, so don't worry about it for now, especially the CSRF blade directive that you can see within the view file. So if we open our directory structure and go to resources views, we see that we have a new directory here called transactions, and we have the create blade template. And in here we have a simple form and this CSRF blade directive. To give you a bit of context, CSRF or cross-site request forgery is a type of security attack where a malicious website can trick a user's browser into submitting a form to your application without the user's knowledge. Laravel's CSRF directive automatically generates a token that must be present when sending post requests, which prevents these kind of attacks. Alright, so let's maybe start filling in the store method within our transaction controller because we need some data before we can run meaningful queries, right? This method receives an instance of Laravel's request class. We can use this request object to access the form data. We will also discuss the request object in more detail a bit later, including how to validate inputs and handle files. So don't worry about it too much right now. We'll get to it in time. For now, we're simply going to call the get method on the request object to retrieve the values that correspond to our form's input names. After collecting these values, we can then call the create method on the transaction service class to handle the database logic. Yes, you could write your SQL queries here in the controller, but I personally prefer to keep controllers lean and delegate business logic to other classes. This keeps controller methods cleaner and more focused on request handling and not the heavy logic. It also encourages reusability and makes testing simpler. In larger team-based projects, this separation of concern is crucial for maintainability and future of your application. For small or personal projects, you might see everything in one file or even directly within the routes file. I've seen some projects like that as well, and that's fine if it meets your needs and your project is relatively small. I have pretty strong opinions about certain architectural choices, but I'll show you multiple approaches so you can decide which structure you prefer. Notice the use of Carbon class here. Carbon is a popular PHP library that extends datetime functionality with a more human-readable and fluent API for dealing with dates and times. Laravel comes with Carbon by default, which makes date handling easier and more expressive. So in here, we're creating a new Carbon instance and we're passing the dates that we get from the form. And then we can use the Carbon instance to manipulate the date or format it in a certain way and so on. Also notice that we are not validating or redirecting the user back to the form with errors in here. We'll address the form validation, error messages, and proper request handling a little bit later. So for now, let's just assume that the user's input is valid. Then we need to create this create method within our transaction service class. Now this create method needs to run the insert query to create the record in the transactions table. We can use Laravel's database facade and call the insert method and pass the raw SQL query. Although we'll eventually learn about Eloquent, sometimes you just need raw SQL queries, which is also perfectly fine. dbFacade provides various methods that you can use, and insert method is one of them. Now, while dbFacade is easy to use and it's fine to use it, you could also inject the underlying class as a dependency to avoid using facade if that's what you like. Everyone has their own coding style. Some prefer injecting a database manager rather than using facades. It can make your code more testable and decoupled from the framework, but it is up to you which method you want to go with. If you're comfortable with facades and manage them responsibly, that's also acceptable. So let's inspect the DB facade here. We see that the accessor is DB string. If we open the database service provider, we should be able to find the underlying class for this DB string. So if we scroll down here, we can see that it's registering the connection service. So we click into that, and here we have the DB string, and the underlying class for it is the database manager class. So we could inject this database manager as our dependency and then use that object throughout as needed. So when we call the method insert on the DB facade, it essentially proxies that call to the database manager. So if we inspect the database manager here and search for insert, we see that we get 0 results found, which means that there must be another magic call method here that proxies to another class. So if we scroll down, we have that magic method, and it essentially proxies the method to the connection object. So when we call the insert method, since insert method doesn't exist on the database manager, it proxies it and calls the insert method on the connection. So essentially, you could either inject the database manager in your constructors as a dependency, or you can also inject the connection class and call methods on it, which would work as well. If we check the database service provider again, we see this db.connection, which is getting an instance from the connection method. If we go back here and go to this connection method, this is returning a connection instance. So if we inspect that, we see that we have this connection. So we could either inject this connection directly, which is a concrete implementation, or even inject this connection interface, and it's still going to work. If we search for the db.connection, we should be able to find aliases. So if we open this right here, we see that the DB, first of all, has the alias of database manager or the connection resolver interface, and then DB connection has the connection and connection interface as aliases. It really depends on what you need for your class. You could inject database manager, connection interface, or connection directly. Database manager is the class that we're going to be injecting as our dependency in our constructors. So let me close all of these out. And let's go back to the transaction service. And in here, within the constructor, we're going to inject database manager. So we'll do public read-only database manager, and we can actually make this class read-only. And then instead of db facade insert, we can do this db insert. The first argument that we need to pass here is the raw query, and the second argument is basically your parameter bindings to prevent SQL injection. So we'll do insert into transactions, amount, transaction date, and then description, and we'll use placeholders as our values. As a reminder, never inject values directly into your raw queries. Always use bindings to protect your application from injection attacks. If you took my earlier PHP series, you should already be familiar with this. It's just basic PDO stuff. You could use named bindings or the question mark placeholders. It is up to you which one you want to use. So you could replace these with named bindings and then pass an array that contains the key as your name of the binding, and then the value would be the value for your parameter. So in this case, we're just gonna stick with the question marks and pass the bindings in here. So we'll do amount, date, and description. Let's format that. And we can actually return the result of this, which is Boolean, and set the Boolean as return type here as well. Now notice that I'm passing the date as a Carbon instance here into the parameter bindings array. I am not calling the format YMDHIS, which is a standard database datetime format. What happens is that Laravel does that behind the scenes for us. So if you pass a datetime instance object, it is going to convert that to the appropriate format for you. If we inspect this insert method, which goes to the connection class, we can go to statement, then we can go prepare bindings right here. And in here, as you can see, it checks if the value is instance of the datetime interface, it is going to format it based on whatever the default format is in this method. So if we go to get date format, we see that it's this format that it's going to use by default. And Carbon, as I mentioned, extends the datetime class, and then the datetime class implements datetime interface. All right, so now finally what we need to do is that in controller, after we call the create method, we want to redirect the user back to the transactions page. We can use the redirect helper here and the route helper as well to redirect the user to the appropriate route. And our route name to the transactions page is transactions.index. Now, as I mentioned, you don't have to use these helpers. You can inject the underlying classes if you wanted to, but I'm going to use some helpers throughout this series just to demonstrate that these helpers exist and you don't have to inject every single dependency in the constructor, although it is up to you how you want to structure your application. Alright, so at this point we can test this method out by filling out the form and submitting it. So let's go back to the browser. Let's fill out the form. I'm gonna set this to maybe January 15, set the transaction amount to 500 and description to something like test. Let's click save transaction and we're getting an error that there is no default value for user ID. This makes sense because our transactions table has user ID column that we created before and it's not nullable, so we need to provide the value for it. And since it's a foreign key, it would need to be a user ID that exists within the users table. Otherwise, it's going to fail with another error. We haven't covered users yet and user authentication. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the user ID column from the transactions table. We can create another migration that removes the column from the transactions table and we can add it back later on. So we'll do vendor bin sale bash shell. Then we'll do PHP artisan make migration, remove user ID from transactions. Then we'll open the remove user ID from transactions migration. And in here we'll do table drop column user ID. And I'm not going to define the down method in this case. Now, of course, you could just modify the create transactions migration file and remove it from there. So within the create transactions migration file, we have this right here. So we could get rid of this and run the migrate fresh command to remigrate the database, and that would be fine as well. But if you work in teams or your code has already been deployed on staging or in production, you should not be touching existing migrations. Instead, you should create a new migration files, so that way you're not expecting everyone to know to run migrate fresh command. If you are a solo dev and haven't reached production or staging environment yet, or haven't committed pushed your code, then you can do whatever you want. You don't need to create a new migration file in that case. But for now, I'm just going to be creating new migration files whenever there are changes to the tables. So let's run the migrations, PHP artisan migrate. And we're getting another error that we cannot drop the user ID column because there is a foreign key constraint. If you get this kind of error, what needs to happen is that you need to drop the foreign key first and then drop the column. So we can use the drop foreign method to drop the foreign key. So let's call the drop foreign method. And here we can either pass the foreign key index name if we know, and if not, we can have Laravel figure out what the name is based on the column name. If we want Laravel to figure it out, then we need to pass an array and the column names. In this case, that's user ID. And if we inspect this drop foreign method, we see that it's calling drop index command. And if we further inspect that, we see that it's checking if the index name that we pass is an array. If it is array, it's creating the index name from that array that we pass, and then it just calls the index command, passing in whatever the name it has, whether it figured it out from the array that you pass, or if you pass the string, then it's just going to use that. So now let's try to run the command again, and we see that now it has worked. And the user ID should be removed from the transactions table. Let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh this page and resubmit. And sure enough, we are redirected back to the transactions page. We can check the database to make sure. So let's open that. and we see that the transaction record was actually created. Notice that the created at and updated at are not being set here, they're set to null. That's because we're using the row queries and not Eloquent. Eloquent automatically sets that for you, but since we're not using that yet, this is being set to null. And we don't have the default values set at the migration level, so that's why they're not being set. Instead, what we can do is that within our transaction service, we can set the created at and updated at values manually. So we'll do created at and updated at. And you can either use the MySQL function to set the current date and time, or you can use Carbon to set the current date and time. It is up to you which one you want to use. I'm going to use the MySQL now function to set that. If you wanted to handle this at the database level and not have to specify it here, and you're not using Eloquent, which I said we're going to get to at some point, then you could go back to the transactions migration or create another migration file depending on where you are in your application development cycle. And you would, instead of calling the timestamps method, you would copy these two, put it in here and comment that out, and replace this with table and remove precision since you don't need that in this case. And then instead of having them nullable, you can use current method. And this is basically going to use the current timestamp when adding a record, and then when updating, it's going to use the current timestamp as well for updated at. We don't need that for now since we're going to get to Eloquent eventually, so we're just going to keep it the way it is. All right, so let's give it another try. Let's go ahead and create another transaction. We'll create one for January 14, maybe 25, test 2, save transaction. It worked. Let's go back to the database, open that up, and sure enough, this time it's set correctly. All right, so now we need the method to fetch or get all transactions. So what we need to do is we need to inject the transaction service here as well within our index method. And actually, since we need this transaction service in most of these methods, why don't we inject it in the constructor instead of each method? So we'll take this and create a constructor here, and then we'll create this as read-only, public read-only, and we can actually make the class read-only. So let's update that, and then we can get rid of it from here and from here, and then we can use the correct transaction service object, and we can use the same one in the index method. So let's maybe here call some method called getAll, which is going to return all the transactions for us. So we'll create transactions variable, and we'll call getAll method on the transactions service. Now let's create this method, and in here we're going to use the select method on the DB facade or the database manager object. So we'll do return these DB select and select star from transactions. We can also order by transaction date. Instead of created at, we'll order by the transaction date in descending order. And if for whatever reason the transactions have the same transaction date, then we'll order by the created at, also descending order. If we had filters here, we could add the where clause right here before the order by, and as you can see, this is just a basic SQL query. So we could do something like where transaction date is greater than some date, and then pass the second argument a list of bindings basically to replace these placeholders. But we don't need any filters here for now, so this should be good enough. As I mentioned before, please make sure to use the parameters instead of injecting variables directly in the queries to avoid SQL injection. You can use either the named or question mark parameters and pass the parameter bindings as the second argument to this select method or any method that has bindings parameter available. The select method here returns an array where each element in that array is an object of PHP's std class. The object basically contains the selected table columns as properties. So let's add the array as return type here. Let me close that out. And let's die and dump transactions in here just to see what we get. Let's go to the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, we get an array of 2 items because we created 2 transaction records. And if we open them up, we see that it contains ID, amount, description, transaction date, created at, and updated at properties, because these are the columns that we're selecting. We're selecting all the columns from the table using select star, but you can narrow that down by selecting specific columns. So if we go back and we only select something like ID, amount, transaction date, and description, now the created at and updated at shouldn't be selected anymore. So if we refresh and open these up, we see that only ID, amount, transaction date, and description are selected. Alright, so let's now also create other CRUD related operations before hooking it up to the front end. We're going to need to update the transaction, and we're going to need to delete the transaction as well. So let's create the update method in here. We'll call it public function update, and we're going to accept the transaction ID, amount, date, and description. So let's autocomplete that, and it's missing the amount. So we'll do float amount. And we can actually call this ID to not be redundant. Since we are within the transaction service context, we know that the ID refers to the transaction ID. Then we'll do this DB update, and update method is similar to select insert method. We can provide the update query as the first argument and then the bindings as the second argument. We can actually use the named parameters here because it makes sense to not confuse the order of parameters. So we'll do amount, date, description, and then ID, and we should probably also update the updated at as well. And as the second argument, we'll pass the bindings. And in this case, we're going to return whatever the update method returns, which returns number of affected rows. So we'll change this from bool to integer. And then we also need a method to delete the transaction. So we'll do public function delete ID, and then we'll do return this db delete, pass the delete query here. So we'll do delete from transactions where ID equals, and here we can use a placeholder and pass ID this way. We also need to change this from bool to integer. And I think we might as well fill in this find transaction method in here because we have this hard-coded to return an array with transaction ID and amount from before. Instead of calling this find transaction, we're simply going to call it find and pass ID, and then we'll return the found transaction object. Now in here we can either use the select method and basically do something like select star from transactions where ID equals ID, and we can use the placeholder here this way. And remember that select returns an array, so we would have to do something like 0 in here, or otherwise return null or something like that, and make this nullable std class. But Laravel actually has another method here called select1, which essentially does the same thing. So we can do select1 and pass the query, and this is going to return a single value. If we inspect this, we see that it calls the select and then it returns the first element from the list of records. And if there are no records, it will just return null. Now in controller, where we use the find transaction, we'll replace this with find, and this should still work. And then here we need to return the edit view instead of returning some string. And we can actually rename this from show to the edit because we won't really need to display the transaction info at this time. We want to be able to just edit the transaction. If you wanted to display the transaction information, then you'd use the show method and maybe return a different view. In our case, we're gonna call this the edit and find the transaction and then return the edit transaction view and pass the transaction information to it. So we'll return here view and then transactions edit, and we'll pass the date from the transaction. So we'll do transaction date, and then amount, transaction amount, and description, transaction description. Now notice that I'm not checking if the transaction exists or not in here. We're not worrying about the validation at this time. We'll move on to the validation and all that later on. Next, we need to create the destroy method. So let's actually add one right here, public function destroy. which is going to call the delete method on the transaction service. So we'll do this transaction service delete, and we'll pass the transaction ID to the destroy method, same way we're passing it to the edit method. It is part of the URL. We are going to also redirect to the transactions page after we've deleted the transaction. So let's add the redirect response as a return type here. And we'll do the same thing here actually, since we're returning the redirect. And this one is returning view, so we need to change the string to the view return type since we're returning view. All right, now that we're using the redirect helper in multiple places, we can inject the redirector in the constructor, and I think it's going to be more expressive to do something like this redirect to and then pass the route. This is more readable in my opinion than redirect route. This is redirect to route, which is a bit more expressive. So let's inspect the redirect function here. We see that we're getting the redirect from the container. So we need to search for this to find out what it's bound to. And if we scroll down, we see it within the route service provider. It is bound to this redirector class. So we can just inject this redirector in our controller's constructor and then use that in our methods. So we'll do public redirector redirect. Let's import that and then replace the redirect here as well. So this redirect to this route. The reason I want to use the dependency injection here and not the redirect helper anymore is because I think we feel that we are starting to rely on helpers too much in this class. And I like to keep things balanced. Before we were just using it in one place, but now that we're starting to use it in more methods, then I like to inject it as a dependency and use it. Plus, it is more expressive this way. This redirect to route makes more sense than just redirect route. Next, we need to add the update method as well, because this one just renders the view, and then we need the actual update method to update the transaction. So we'll do public function update, and we're going to pass the transaction ID here as well and the request object, and it's also going to return the redirect response. So we're going to basically retrieve the information from the form, because this is going to render the same form that we have for the create transaction. So we're going to take this, and actually let's copy this whole thing and paste it in here, and instead of create, we'll call update and pass the transaction ID as the first argument. And as I mentioned before, we're not worrying about validation for now. Of course, these methods need validations, but that's something that we're going to talk about separately later on. So for now, just assume the best case scenarios that everything is valid, because we will need to check if the transaction actually exists that we're passing. We need to check if the transaction exists here. We need to validate the data that's being passed, the required fields and all that. And we're going to cover that a bit later. Now let's adjust our routes in our routes file. We need the new route for the delete or the destroy method. So we're going to use the delete HTTP method. We're going to come back to that in a bit, so just put a pin in it. So we'll do delete and then same route / transaction ID. And it's going to call the destroy method, and we'll call it destroy. Then we need the post method for the same URL for the update. So we'll do post transaction ID, and it's going to call update, and we'll name this update as well. And we're going to rename this show to edit, and also rename this to edit, because show is to display the transaction information and edit is to display the form that actually edits that transaction. So we'll add /edit in here as well. And now we can move on to the front end. Now, as far as the front end is concerned, I'm going to paste in some generic Tailwind CSS table that I generated using ChatGPT, and then filled it in with the loop basically that iterates over the past transactions variable. So I'm going to paste that in our transactions index blade template. We're going to paste it in here. And as you can see, it's just a simple table displaying the date, amount, and description. and we're iterating over the transactions that is being passed to this template. If we go to transactions controller, we have these transactions, and we need to pass that to our blade. So we'll do transactions, and then whatever that is, we're iterating over it, and then we're displaying a row for each transaction, and then for each row, we're formatting the date, we're formatting the amount, and then we're displaying the description. And then we're also displaying the delete and edit buttons. Notice that the edit button redirects the user to the edit route, and the delete button is within this form right here. This form makes a post request to the destroy route. The thing is, our destroy route is registered as a delete HTTP method in the web routes file, and we're not able to set the method to delete in here. We have to instruct Laravel somehow that this request is a delete request and not a regular post request. To do that, we need to provide a hidden input field called method to kind of spoof the HTTP verb when making a delete put or patch requests. Laravel provides a blade directive that adds that hidden field for us, so that's what this method blade directive right here is. It adds the hidden input field and lets Laravel know that this is a delete request and therefore look for the matching delete route. Now let's open the browser to see this UI in action. Let's refresh the page, and sure enough, we see that the table is displaying two transaction rows correctly. If we inspect element here on the edit button, we see that we have the proper route for the edit, and then for the delete, we have the form with two hidden input fields. One is the token, that's the CSRF token that I talked about earlier, and the method is set to delete. Now, in real application, you probably would be using some JavaScript instead of putting forms in each row in here. Because as you can imagine, rendering HTML form for each table row is not efficient. We don't even have pagination yet here, so the loading of the page could take a while, and it could even crash the browser at some point. There is also the concern of browser support, which I'm not sure where the IE edge is at currently. So simply speaking, using JavaScript here is the right way. I just don't want to focus on writing JavaScript right now to demonstrate some Laravel functionalities. So we're going to leave this as is, and we may refactor this later using JavaScript. Just know that there are better ways of doing this in the front end. Alright, so now let's add the blade template for editing the transaction. We can copy the create transaction blade and basically adjust it as needed. So we'll call this edit blade template. We're going to call this edit transaction and call the header title edit transaction as well. And then the route we're going to adjust to transactions update, and we need to pass the transaction ID as an argument to the route because route has that parameter, right? So we need to pass that in here, and then we need to set the values on the input fields so that they're pre-filled for us. So we'll do value equals date, and then value equals amount. And let's do the content here for the text area will be description, and everything else remains the same. Now, of course, you could create reusable component here and use it in both the create and edit templates, but we're not going to worry about that for now. All right, let's test this out. So let's go to the browser. Let's click on edit button, and we're getting undefined transaction ID. That's because we're not passing that from the controller. So if we go here, we need to pass the transaction ID parameter in here. So let's do it this way, format, let's go back, refresh, and sure enough, it works. Now notice that it's adding these lots of spaces. That's because of the way I have this description in here. Let's move it this way. Let's go back, and sure enough, now it's correct. Let's update the amount here to maybe 250 and then test updated. Maybe update the date to January 17, save transaction, and sure enough, it got updated and we were redirected back to the transactions page. We have January 17, amount 250, and test updated. Let's try to delete the transaction. So we click delete, we get a prompt whether we're sure to delete the transaction or not. We click OK, and it got deleted and we redirected back to transactions page. Let's do the same here. And if there are no transactions, we're displaying no transactions found. Alright, so we got some basic CRUD operations working in here. Let's now work on the totals, because the goal was to replace these from being hard-coded values to actual proper calculated data. So let's add a method to basically get the total income, total expense, and then calculate the net savings. So we'll go to the transaction controller, and we want to replace these values in here. So let's first go to the transaction service, and we'll add methods here called get total income. So we'll do public function get total income, and this will return float. And then we can of course call the select method and do the select sum query to get the proper value, or we can use a method called scalar to have the value be returned right away instead of us having to select it from the object. So we'll do basically something like return this db scalar and do select some amount from transactions where amount is greater than 0 because we want the income. We can also cast this to float to make sure that the return type value is float. And then we can do the same thing for the expense. So we'll do get total expense, and then we'll do where amount is less than 0. The scalar is basically very useful when you're returning a single scalar value. So when you're doing something like sum amount and it's the single value that's being returned, then this is basically easier than doing the select and then selecting the column from the object. Now in controller, we can replace the total income and total expense with variables. So we'll do income equals this transaction service get total income, and then expense equals get total expense, and then replace this with income, this with expense, and then we'll actually calculate the net savings by doing income minus expense. And we're just left with the goal hard-coded value here, and we don't have a table or column that stores or calculates this value for now, so we're just going to set this to 0 for now. We can always fix that later if and when we add the support for goal tracking. Now, of course, we're running 2 queries here, and this could be optimized to run a single query to select both total income and total expense using case expression. We can add another method within the transaction service here called get totals. So public function get totals, and this is going to return an object of std class. And we'll do something like return this db select one, and then do select sum, and then use case expression here. So case when amount is greater than 0, then return amount, otherwise return 0, and select this as income, and then do the same thing for expense with amount being less than 0, and then call this expense. We are selecting all of these from transactions, and that should be it. Now we can update the controller accordingly. So let's actually try this first, and then I'll update it to the other one. So let's go back to the browser, refresh the page, and of course everything is 0 because we don't have any transactions. Let's create a couple of transactions here. So we'll do one with 500 as income, called test. And sure enough, the total income got updated to 500. Let's create one expense. So we'll do maybe minus 200, and then do test 2, save. And we see that there are a couple of issues here. One is this negative 200 being displayed here, which is kind of an UI issue, but we shouldn't even be displaying the minus sign here because we're already saying this is an expense, so it's kind of redundant to show the minus sign. And then the net savings actually has a logical error in there where instead of 300, it's showing 700. What's happening is that we're calling sum in here on the amount where amount is less than 0, so it's returning a negative value. And then we're subtracting that from income, so negative negative becomes plus, and we're just adding them up. So what we need to do is that we need to return the absolute value here. So we'll do absolute this way, and then we'll do the same thing in here. Let's test this out. Let's open the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, now the total expense is displaying correctly, and net savings is being calculated correctly as well. Now let's test the other method to make sure that the get totals works as expected. So instead of running two queries here, we'll run one query by calling single method called get totals, and then we'll call this variable totals, and then we'll do income equals totals income, and then expense equals totals expense, format it, go back to the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, it still works. Let's adjust the expense amount here to maybe 150, save transaction, and sure enough, it works. Now, if you wanted to use a separate connection for some of these queries, you could use the connection method on the DB facade or the DB object that we have in here from the database manager. You could do something like this DB connection and then call select one on it. And then you would specify which connection you wanted to use. This, of course, would assume that you have your connections configured correctly in the database configuration file. You could even get the underlying PDO instance if you wanted to by calling get PDO and then interact with the PDO object directly. So as you can see, Laravel is pretty flexible and you can do many things with it. Alright, so I think this is it for now. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the database transactions. So thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button if you liked it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy coding.